All right. Welcome to the Great War Discussion Group. Lee Denniston requires very little introduction. First, I do want to comment that it is not true that he has been volunteering at the museum since it was opened in 1926. He has been volunteering only since the 1980s. So I do want to Lee's topic is something he's been long interested in, which is one of the great scientific advances of the war. A couple of months ago, I shared with you some of the positive medical advances that came out of the war. The new exhibit in Wiley will look at some of the advances in prosthetics, another positive advance. Lee will be talking about one of the negative advances, which is the widespread use of chemical warfare. Lee, go ahead.
Okay, well, it's not true that chemical warfare began in World War I. There are historical references to it as far back as the 5th century BC, with the Spartans using the toxic smoke from burning sulfur against Athenians. And it crops up again and again through history. During the Crimean War in 1855, the British actually considered using a number of chemicals, to include various extremely poisonous ones, against the Russians, but they were never quite able to get their act together and actually do it. However, somebody must have been thinking about the threat, because well, if I could make it go, there we go. In 1899, there was a meeting in The Hague with the aim of writing rules for warfare. And one of the rules they came up with was this one. If you're reading it on a small screen, it reads, "The contracting powers agree to abstain from the use of projectiles, the sole object of which is the diffusion of asphyxiating or deleterious gases." Now, most of the countries that were there agreed to that. Interestingly, one country that didn't was the United States. Our delegate to the meeting was Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, who at the time was probably the premier naval theorist in the world. And the comments of the US can be boiled down to, killing is killing, and it doesn't make any sense to quibble how you do it. Of course, we didn't have any chemical weapons, but I guess we were keeping our possibilities open. Now, once you get into World War I, of course, a lot of rules go by the wayside, sometimes very quickly. And interestingly, the first people to use chemicals were the French. They employed some tear gas grenades that had been developed for their police during the very early days in August. Very quickly came to the conclusion that there wasn't any point in it, and quit doing it. However, it was later used by the Germans as part of the justification for their use of chemicals. Now, the whole early days we know about, the buildup and the Battle of the Frontiers and the buildup of the stalemate on the Western Front, change in the German chief of the general staff, and this new guy, Falkenhayn, was looking for a way to break that stalemate. One of his officers was the brother of a prominent chemist who convinced him to try chemical warfare. And in October 1914, they fired about 3,000 artillery rounds filled with dianisodine sulfonate, which would have been a tear gas, at the British. Only problem is nobody noticed, and nobody had a real good explanation for it. The best explanation I have found is that when they made their shells, they got over enthusiastic with the explosive bursting charge, with the result that when the shell went off, most of the chemical was destroyed in the explosion, and what was left was so finely divided that it didn't bother anyone. Okay, think it through. Well, two conclusions. One, we didn't use enough. Two, we used the wrong stuff. So let's try it a bit later against the Russians. Now, in January, at a place that's just west of modern-day Warsaw, they fired 6 times as many shells filled with a different stuff, xylobromide, also a tear gas. Only problem was the temperature was much below the freezing point of the chemical, so the shell goes off, and instead of spreading this irritating gas, it drops chunks of frozen chemical. Puzzled Germans once more time. Enter Fritz Haber. Now, at this point, Fritz Haber is one of the most prominent chemists, not just in Germany, but in the world. He is the director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry, which is one of the primary research institutes in the world. And he is a man who made 2 contributions to the German war effort. I got to divert a little from chemical warfare here because his other one was almost as important, and it has to do with the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen in the soil is necessary for plants to grow. That includes crops and anything that feeds animals. Now, there's a lot of nitrogen in the air. About 80% of what we breathe is nitrogen, but it's in a form that's almost new, can't be used for anything. But in nature, there's a cycle that puts it back in the soil enough to keep the crops growing. And as long as you don't mess with it, it'll work fine. The only problem is human beings come along with agriculture. We take nitrogen out of the soil without putting it back. And after a while, the soil becomes rather poor, crop rates go down, and there's a problem. You got to find a way to put nitrogen back into the soil artificially. Only this type, it's natural nitrates. The first one was guano, bird poop. Somebody discovered that there were islands in the Pacific and in the Caribbean where seabirds had been nesting for tens of thousands of years. And there were deposits of old bird poop that were as much as 200 feet thick. They began to mine it and put it on ships and send it around the world. And for about 50 years, starting the early days of the 19th century through the middle of the century, this became the source of fertilizer. Now, about 1850, there's a mineral called caliche, was discovered mostly in Chile. And it's potassium nitrate and sodium nitrate and iodine and other useful things, fairly easy to mine. And it very quickly became a major export for Chile. By the time we get to the years just before World War I, there's 11 million tons of this stuff being exported every year. And a third of it is going to Germany, which has no natural source of nitrates. Now, that's all been all about the plants. However, there's another thing that you need nitrates for, and that is to make explosives. And the problem that Germany would have had is that their stockpile of nitrates at the start of World War I was sufficient, if you only used it for explosives, to last them through the end of 1915, at which point, no more war. However, going back to Fritz Haber again, what he came up with was a process that could take that nitrogen out of the air, the one that you can't really use, combine it with hydrogen, which is easy to make, high temperature, high pressure, and the right catalyst. And what you end up with at the end of it is ammonia. And the ammonia can then be used to make nitric acid and all the other things that you need nitrogen for. So Germany's war effort carried on after 1915 almost exclusively because they had the Haber process. Now, so did everybody else. And just by the way, it continues to be used on a vast scale all around the world because that's where you get things like the anhydrous ammonia that you see around here all the time. Now, Haber was from a Jewish family. He converted to Christianity, I think, primarily as a step forward in the German system, but he wanted to be the most German of Germans. This quote comes from him. I think you'll find a lot of scientists who still will debate that subject, but the point is that Haber threw himself into the process of running German chemical warfare wholeheartedly, to the point that as a man of Jewish origins with absolutely no previous military experience, he was given a special commission as a Hauptmann, a captain from the Kaiser. Now, it's typical of German system that the substantive rank you have may not show just how much influence you have, because Haber basically ran German chemical warfare in World War I as the equivalent of a captain, a position that belonged to generals in the French, British, and American armies. Now, the first successful use of chemical warfare, of course, was the chlorine attack near Ypres in Belgium in April of 1915. This was Haber's suggestion. He knew the strengths and weaknesses of the very large German chemical industry, biggest in the world, actually. And chlorine for them was the product of making dyes. It's a waste product, actually. They had a lot of it. So they moved about 6,000 canisters forward. They had to wait a month after they moved the canisters into the trenches until the wind was in the right direction, and then they opened it. This photograph is labeled an aerial view of that German attack. Now, about 1,100 French soldiers died, thousands others were hurt, and there was a big hole in Allied lines, but it had been an experiment. And the Germans really didn't bring in enough reserves to be able to, number one, exploit it, and number two, German soldiers moving forward are looking down at these poor dead French soldiers who have died in agony and looking forward, and there's the cloud of chlorine. And basically it was a case of, I don't think I'm going any further. Now, the Allied response, of course, is shock, horror. Shouldn't have been. There had already been discussions about it on the Allied side as well. And there was actually a deserter by the name of Jaeger who came over a couple of days before the attack and gave them full information, what the agent was, how it would be dispersed, et cetera, and the Allies didn't believe him and sent him off to a prison camp. And now he spent the rest of the war in relatively safe conditions. Once he got back to Germany after the war, however, there was eventually a book put out by a British officer who revealed his name, at which point the German government arrested him, tried him for treason, and sent him to prison. Now, the Brits and the French were way behind the power curve when it came to chemicals. As it turned out, there was one factory in Britain that was capable of making liquid chlorine at the rate of 1 ton per day. The April attack had used 160 tons. There was a couple of small plants in France that could do it. Everybody went around frantically trying to put together an organization to deal with it, and finally managed to build up enough that the British conducted a chemical attack in September of 1915. This is a British newspaper's rather overdramatic view of what they did. Of course, they're charging together in massed formations, just what you want to do against a machine gun. And the Germans, who are cowering in their trenches, don't have masks. Actually, they probably weren't well protected. They didn't expect this. But it didn't go all the British way. In some areas, the cloud of chlorine went off and went where it was supposed to go and did what it was supposed to do. In other areas, the wind changed and came back into the British trenches. And there were quite a few British casualties from the chlorine. In addition, some of the British troops who were delegated to open the tanks discovered that the wrenches they had didn't fit the tank. In one case, supposedly a British NCO got very upset about the whole thing, decided he was going to open the tank up by firing a shot into it, and proceeded to be bathed in liquid chlorine. When they recovered his body, it was described as being entirely green. I also see things in this drawing like the guy here who's busy throwing a grenade ahead of him and running in the same direction that the grenade is going. This is not a recommended course of action. Now, it builds up slowly over time, but the problem is one of, first of all, what are you going to do? And secondly, how are you going to do it? What are you going to do? Well, we can classify the agents, first of all, as choking asphyxiants. The two big ones are chlorine and phosgene. The Germans use diphosgene, which is a slightly different version of phosgene, supposedly because it's easier to handle. They all attack the lungs. Chlorine by converting to hydrochloric acid when it hits the water in your lungs, chemical burn. Phosgene attacks the proteins in the little air sacs in your lungs, and you end up drowning. Now, chlorine, you can smell in very small concentrations. You see it coming. And it has an immediate effect. Phosgene, first of all, the effect is delayed, sometimes by hours or as much as a day, although death can occur very quickly once it sets in. But it has such a low odor, but by the time you smell it, you've already inhaled a very toxic dose of it. The one thing they found they could do, besides just automatically masking anytime there was a suspicion of it, was if you're smoking, it changes the taste of the cigarette. So they would put gas sentries out smoking to let them know. Secondly, blister agents or vesicants. Now, this one is mustard in World War I. Basically, if it gets on your skin, it's a very, very severe irritant, and it builds up huge, nasty blisters. Again, mustard takes a little while. You may not know it right away when it gets on your skin. They called it mustard because it has a sharp smell that somebody thought was like English mustard. It's not particularly deadly compared to, say, chlorine or phosgene, but it causes a lot more injuries and takes a long time to recover from. Among other things, if those of you who remember the gassed painting, those troops were suffering from what was usually temporary blindness as a result of the fumes from mustard. And mustard, by the way, gets called a gas. It's not. It's dispersed as a very fine spray from exploding shells. It's a thick, oily liquid. Tear agents or lacrimatories. Now, there's a lot of chemicals that were used one time or another in small amounts as tear agents. The big ones, however, one of them is chloropicrin. Now, this chemical is a bit toxic, somewhat toxic by itself, but it has the advantage of being able to penetrate a lot of the masks that were developed during the war. It's a nasty irritant, gets into your eyes, your nose, your lungs. It also has the fun advantage that if you get a good snootful of it, you vomit. And of course, vomiting inside a gas mask is unfun. Both the British and the Germans experimented with compounds containing arsenic. These things would have been dispersed basically as fine smoke, particles, not gases. And again, it was thought that they could penetrate masks. And they're a great deal more irritating and have impacts that last for a whole lot longer. The thing was that neither the British nor the Germans actually figured out a way to effectively do it. So they were used in small amounts mostly experimental, I would say, rather than being used in heavy quantities. You also have blood agents, hydrogen cyanide, cyanogen chloride. What these do is interfere with the ability of the blood to carry oxygen to your tissues. Basically, they cause you to suffocate because your blood isn't working anymore. The British and the Germans looked at these, fiddled with them, and decided not to use them. They thought that they were too hard to build up enough of a concentration to be of any use, and they're kind of sensitive compounds. They break down pretty quickly. The French, for whatever reason, loved them and continued to use them throughout the war. And when we got into the war and started getting artillery ammunition from the French, we got a lot of cyanogen chloride shells from them. Now, smoke was also considered a chemical agent back then. White phosphorus burns, produces wildly huge clouds of white gas, white smoke. Something called stannic chloride, which fumes up white in a somewhat toxic cloud as soon as you expose it to the air. There's a lot of others that go on. White phosphorus, by the way, was a fun thing that they like to use to shoot at machine gun nests with. Because not only would you blind the machine gun nests, you'd cover them with these little specks of burning phosphorus that you can't put out. White phosphorus is illegal to use in modern war for the most part. Finally, flame. That's mostly oil of one sort or another. Everybody had, after the Germans came up with them first, flamethrowers. They weren't particularly effective. They were scary. I've fired a modern flamethrower, and it is scary even to shoot. And the other one is thermite, which is a mixture of iron oxide powder along with powdered aluminum and an igniter, something like a strip of magnesium. Once you get it going, it burns by itself violently, and it produces a cloud of little bitty specks of molten iron. And it's another thing that they like to shoot at machine gun nests. Now, chemicals can be broken down into two basic classes. Non-persistent, it just is not toxic for a very long period of time. Maybe it disperses, the wind blows it away. A lot of these compounds break down, particularly in humid conditions. Generally, it'll be toxic for a period of maybe a few minutes to a few hours. I say exceptions there because both, for example, chlorine and phosgene are heavier than air. So they would pool at the bottom of a shell crater where it was kind of sheltered. And if you jumped into the shell crater later on, you'd stir this up. It would also last longer in the woods than in the open. But the advantage of a non-persistent agent is you can shoot it in an enemy position, wait for a little bit, and then charge into the enemy position and still be reasonably safe. Persistent agents, on the other hand, can be toxic for very long periods of time. Hours, days, weeks. There are still mustard shells from World War I found that are still filled with active mustard. The stuff can last for a very long time. Different purposes and uses to a considerable extent from non-persistent. You can do it, for example, to contaminate a piece of ground that you don't want the enemy to cross. Or if you shoot it at an artillery battery, you contaminate their guns. They really can't work the guns for a long time. Mustard itself, well, the Germans first used it in 1917. It took the Allies almost a year to be able to produce it. The first time it was used by the Germans, they got all these reports back of this strange stuff coming in, shells that just sounded like a plop instead of an explosion. And people had to go out and find duds in order to be able to recover the shell to see what was in it. And that, I can only think, must have been a really fun job. Sharp odor, it takes several hours for the skin effects to take hold. It didn't kill many. The death rate from mustard is 2-3%, but it became the most feared agent. Your mask would protect you against phosgene and chlorine to at least an extent. This stuff gets on your skin, gets around your body. The fumes get in your eyes if you're not careful. There were soldier rumors that the Germans had this version of mustard that would make some part of your body turn black and fall off. I'll leave it to your imagination which ones they were talking about. Useful mostly because of it, persistent, and by the end of the war, this is the one that's being most widely used by everybody. Blisters look like that, and that's probably the most famous single picture of a mustard casualty. Now, mostly the treatment supports them and people recover, but it still takes a long time in some cases. Now, how do you fire it? How do you deliver it? The first one, obviously, is cloud gas. That's the same picture that's up in the East Gallery, and it's labeled as a French chlorine attack in January of 1917. You bring the tanks forward into the trenches. You wait till the wind is in the right direction. You open it and let it drift over the enemy. It's an inefficient use of the chemicals because a lot of it disperses or goes into the air or just gets used up in the atmosphere before it gets to the enemy. And by 1916, the French and the Germans had pretty much quit using cloud gas as a delivery method. Still, it shows up occasionally. But mostly they used artillery because they thought it was more flexible and they had more control over the concentrations of gas in the target areas. The British continued to use cloud gas for a couple of reasons. First of all, because they were continually short of artillery ammunition, and they didn't want to use the shell cases that would have been filled with high explosives to fill them with chemicals, whatever chemicals you wanted to use. Secondly, because the guy that was running the British special brigades that were in charge of doing it in the battlefield liked cloud gas, and he insisted on continuing to use it. Artillery, as I said, the British used cloud gas, although they did have artillery shells as well. The Germans and the French used artillery. As the war goes on, the Germans in particular become very inventive. They do some very, very clever tactics for the use of their artillery, both conventional and with gas. The French pretty much stay with the standard deliveries of bunches of gas on the target, but they will do things like keep it at a low firing rate and just keep an area saturated with gas for hours on end with the aim of exhausting the German soldiers in that area. And that turned out to be fairly effective. By the way, when you read a lot of these accounts, you'll hear mention of things like Yellow Cross and Green Cross. For the most part, that comes from the markings that the Germans used on their shells. Everybody has their own system of marking for the chemical shells, but the accounts in English, since they're on the receiving end of German artillery, generally talk about the German ones. Green Cross was used for phosgene and chlorine. Sometimes you would mix, by the way, chloropicrin in with that just to try to make the mix all the much more fun on the receiving end. Yellow Cross is mustard. You notice it's got a different fuse because what they want to do is have that to be what we would call a super quick fuse today. In other words, it bursts instantly on the slightest impact so that the mustard gets spread more. Blue Cross, in this version of it, is one of the experimental ones with the arsenical chemical in it. And those chemicals were so corrosive that if you just filled the shell with them, they'd eat through the shell. So what you did is put the chemical into a glass bottle and put it into an explosive charge inside the Blue Cross shell. There was also a White Cross shell that I don't have a picture of that was for tear agents. Now, in the middle of 1917, the British come up with a new way of delivering this stuff, invented by a Royal Engineer officer named Livens. And it's called the Livens projector. And it's a fairly thin-walled metal tube, about 3 feet long. You bury it in the ground to aim it. Put a base plate on it so it doesn't bury too much further. You put a projecting charge of usually black powder in the bottom, and this drum of chemicals goes on top, and it also has a bursting charge on it. Now, an artillery shell, most of them would deliver 2, 3, 4 pounds of chemical per projectile. A Livens projector would deliver 30 to 40 pounds per tank, depending on which one you used. Range at the start of when they first began using them was about 1,000 yards. By the end of the war, they've got them up to 3,000 yards. These things are employed in vast numbers, hundreds up to nearly 3,000 in one attack towards the end of the war. Their advantage is that there's no chemical dispersed on the way over. The chemical drum lands, it's got a small explosive burster in it. It bursts, and you've got an instant killing cloud where that thing has landed. And if you're throwing something like mustard, you can contaminate a huge area very, very quickly. There is film of these things being fired. It's really impressive. And for some of the German comments are that they feared this more than almost anything else, just because it was so instantly effective when it hit the ground. Now, there's some disadvantages to it. It takes a while to emplace them. And if you're going to use them, you probably emplace them between the first and second line of your own trenches. But if you're going to shoot them, you pull your own troops out of your first line just in case there's a short round. Now, for all versions of ways to deliver chemicals, they are not popular with the infantry, because as for both sides, as soon as you get hit with chemicals, the response is to shoot back a heavy retaliatory barrage. And of course, that lands on the infantry. By the way, this projector stays in both the British and the American arsenals into World War II. I found a field manual for the Livens projector M1, United States Army, dated August 1942. Never used in World War II, but it was still around. Gas masks, of course. How do you protect yourself? And we all know the story about pee on the pad of cloth and hold it over your face, which actually would have worked as long as the concentration didn't get too deep. Now, on the British side, there were some early attempts that were described as being useless when dry and asphyxiating when wet, but they came up with a padded version, and you'll notice that each soldier has a little bottle in his hand. And those were the chemicals that you put on to the mask to keep it wet and to filter out usually at this point, still chlorine that the Germans are using against you. This is probably a little bit later, maybe late 1915, because at that point they've got goggles to protect their eyes. It's the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, by the way. Now, the Germans early on were actually not a whole lot better off. I think this is a staged picture. It shows a couple of German medical personnel administering aid using some kind of a ventilator or oxygen apparatus to a gas victim. I say it's staged because the two guys in the background aren't wearing masks. But everybody, of course, immediately goes to work to develop masks. Now, when I first started into this, I was going to follow down the ancestry of all these masks. If I did that, we'd be here till next week. But they all follow a lot of the same pattern. The first ones are pretty simple. The British helmet we've got a couple of those in the East Gallery. The P helmet, the PH helmet, those are indicators of the chemicals that have been impregnated into the mask so that it decontaminates whatever chemical it is. The French M2 is actually significantly more comfortable than the P helmet or the later British mask. It's made out of up to 32 layers of cloth, and it goes on like a horse's feed bag. And the layers are impregnated with different chemicals to protect. Italy has the polyvalente. The mask carrier says size small, take off this mask and you'll die, keep it with you at all times. They produce almost none of them. And Italian soldiers are very badly protected against gas, and it pays a serious price later on at Caporetto. The Russians do have a mask of their own, the Zelensky Kumant, and that thing sticking out the front is not for your nose. It's called a finger horn. The mask is made out of rubber, and what that lets you do is put your finger on that thing, push it inside the mask, and wipe off the inside of the lenses. Now, unlike the other countries that use various chemicals along with activated charcoal in their filters, the Russian mask has only activated charcoal in it. It really wasn't all that good. Now, the British eventually come up with the small box respirator, just like the one we've got on display. There's a large box respirator, too, that preceded it, but it was just too big and clumsy to use. It's uncomfortable. You have to clip your nose shut and breathe through your mouth. The mask itself is made out of rubberized cloth. And as it turns out, the Russians buy lots of them. The Italians eventually buy lots of them. The United States, when we first get into the war, buys 100,000 of them because we ain't got none of our own. It's rated as one of the better masks, and they change what's in the filter regularly in order to try and keep up with the changes in the enemy's chemicals. This is the later French one, the ARS. They kind of copy the German mask, which they had seen, and it becomes that screw on the front. It's much more comfortable and more effective than the old M2. But again, the changes in the agents being used means you've got to continually improve the filters. The Germans have two kinds of masks. The one on the left here is rubber, but they run out of rubber. So they switched to using lambskin from Bulgaria. And it gets treated so it's completely impenetrable. And again, screw-on filter on the front and a pretty good mask can that protects it. Now, all of these masks have two problems. One, they're very uncomfortable to wear, often difficult to see out of. The troops don't like it, and sometimes people will actually reach the point of ripping the mask off. They just can't stand it anymore, even if you're in a chemical cloud. Secondly, the filters wear out. Sometimes after exposure for a while, sometimes if the cloud of gas you're in is too dense. But everybody's got them. Training on use of them is spotty from country to country. There also were, by the way, gas suits. Now, these are American. We grabbed the idea from the British, who were trying to do the same thing. These happen to be made from different cloths, heavily impregnated with linseed oil, and then rubber boots and gloves, standard mask. And of course, you've got a helmet to cover your head. These were primarily issued to the people who were decontaminating mustard-contaminated areas. They're miserable to wear. Anti-gas suits are hot even today, and back then, a half hour was about all that people could stand. And by the way, there were some experiments where it was discovered that, oops, this stuff really isn't gas proof. Now, how did they test a lot of this stuff? They did it on people. The guy who designed the small box respirator died as a result of testing it himself. And there were quite a few casualties that way. Now, I looked at trying to follow through all the different gas attacks and everything that went on relative to the use of gas. And again, we'd be here for weeks. So I'm going to try and summarize for you what happened in each year of the war. 1915, I call the tryouts time. Cloud gas is the exclusive way that it's delivered. Chlorine is the agent. But everybody uses the time to try and organize both an offense and a defense. Now, the British, the French, and the Germans all recognize you need specialist troops to deliver chemicals. The Germans put together what they call the Gaspioniere regiment, a gas combat engineer regiment with an experienced engineer colonel in command. They get trained by Haber, and they get continually updated by Haber. The Germans have the best organization at the high end because Haber is overall in control of the offensive part of it. German medical personnel deal with the mask design. And Germany has the biggest chemical factory system in the world. And they are immediately turned over to the production of chemical agents, as well as the production of material needed for protection against chemicals. The French, what they do is basically form what they call the Compagnie Z, the Z companies, and they're manned primarily with reservists who they think are maybe a little bit too old for combat, but can still do this reasonably well. Of course, the artillery gets a lot of their chemicals after they get into the use of the artillery. The French don't have a chemical industry as big as the Germans. They end up going around to about 20 different places to try and get the production of chlorine and phosgene started. Their research is reasonably good. French science tends to be a little more centralized, but it still takes a while for them to get effective. The British, as best I can tell, simply grabbed the nearest available Royal Engineer officer, informed him he was now in charge of the Special Company's Royal Engineers. Go figure out how to do this. So he goes back to Britain and starts talking to the people in the scientific community back there. And in what's sometimes referred to as British committee culture, there's one committee that deals with offensive chemical. There's one committee that deals with defensive chemical. There is an experimental station organized at a place called Porton Down. It's still there. But none of them seem to, for quite some time, talk very well to each other. I said there was one factory that produced chlorine. They gave him a contract to ramp up production, but that took a while. And then they just went around and found people who were doing chemical things and gave them a contract to begin production. Eventually, got pretty good quantities coming out, but it took a while. 1916, growing pains. The British, the French, and the Germans shift to artillery mostly. The Germans introduce phosgene. This is another byproduct of their normal chemical industry. The British don't have a single factory in the UK which can produce any quantity of phosgene at all. And the first couple of contracts they let are failures. They finally find a French factory in Calais and pay him through the nose for his intellectual property. But the quantities used begin to expand. They're still not entirely sure what the best way to do it is, but you're going to do it a lot more. And this is for all three. I haven't talked about gas on the Eastern Front just because the information available is not all that good. It was used, and the Germans used it extensively, but I don't have a good picture in my mind what was going on for the most part. 1917, we're getting serious. The British introduced projectors. This comes as a very unpleasant surprise to the Germans. The Germans introduced mustard in the middle of 1917. And here's where the model of how you use chemicals begins to change a bit. 1915, 1916, it was often seen as a way either of preparing an attack, goes along with the artillery bombardment, or as trying to break up enemy preparation for an attack. By 1917, the model is more attrition. Let's see how much harm we can do to the enemy. Let's see how many we can kill, how many we can injure. And part of the target becomes morale. I mentioned how the French would fire limited amounts of chemicals at a specific unit for a long period of time, enough so they couldn't take their masks off, and you ended up exhausting them. The British had a little trick of picking a unit that they didn't like for some reason or another, and they'd pound it with chemicals for a while, enough to make it be withdrawn from the line. They'd keep track of it, and when it went back into the line again, they'd do the same thing, perhaps 2, 3, 4 times. The idea, I believe, was to cause a breakdown of morale in one unit, because that can affect other units. It can spread. Finally, 1918, mass use. The Allies have mustard. Everybody has all the chemicals involved. And sometimes there are saturation attacks. At one point, the city of Armentières was on the flank of an intended German attack. It was held by the British. They didn't want to try and fight into the city, so what they basically did was to saturate it with mustard to the point that liquid mustard was running in the streets, and it was weeks before anybody could come back. It also inflicted about 6,000 civilian casualties, by the way. Now, I say the U.S. arrives there because we really didn't change much in the way gas was being done during the period we were in the war. Our impact on chemical warfare would have come in 1919 for reasons that I will talk about later, but it would be a shift of an order of magnitude in the amount of chemicals involved. Now, how prepared was the U.S.? Well, read this one. Now, in fact, our observers had been sending reports back, but they tended to be pigeonholed. And the basic thing was, we, at this point, were still paying attention to Woodrow Wilson. Now, what did we do? Well, November of 1916, the medical department is given the job of designing a gas mask. Now, I've been on high-level staffs, and I know how this works. Somebody in the medical department got this tasking and basically looked at it and said, yep, understand, I'll get to it when I get through with the higher priority stuff. Absolutely nothing was done. In February of 1917, well, we've severed diplomatic relations with the Germans, and the quartermaster general, who's responsible for supply, asks the adjutant general's department, which was then responsible for coordinating the staff, who's supposed to be doing this? Who's supposed to be providing it? The result was a letter that went out to all the departments saying, does anybody know and does anybody want to take this on? No prizes for what the answers were, with the result that when we declared war, we were as flat-footed as it's possible to be. We knew that chemicals were being used in Europe, but we had no idea how to use them or how to protect ourselves against them. And as in any good Western movie, the cavalry comes over the hill in the very unlikely person of Vanoy Manning, who was the director of the U.S. Bureau of Mines. Now, the Bureau of Mines has been around for a number of years. And one of their jobs is to deal with the problem of noxious fumes and noxious gases in mines and the design of respirators for miners. They've got chemists, they've got people who know how to make masks, and Manning offers his services. And the War Department gratefully accepts. A chemist from the Bureau of Mines becomes the director of chemical warfare research for the War Department. And a good proportion of the people doing the research actually came from the Bureau of Mines. And Manning has his hands on a lot of stuff relative to the development of particularly defensive, but also offensive chemical warfare capabilities. Now, at the end of April 1917, the board of the American University, which at the point was a struggling Methodist university on the outskirts of D.C., they had a big chunk of land that was available. They offered it to the War Department, which again accepted gracefully. And it became the American University Experiment Station. We're on the outskirts of D.C., and this is where the experimentation on the development of chemical weapons for the United States goes on. To start with, this building in the background, chemistry building, is about all that was there. What happens is that building goes on higgledy-piggledy. Chemical experiments occur all over the place. They have trials with what happens if you explode a chemical shell on the ground inside this experiment station, not all that far from people's houses. They eventually decide, well, I've got stuff to get rid of. And the recommendation they get from the British is dig a big hole and bury it, which is what they do. Now, things happen like there was an accident with one particular agent that drifted off reservation and attacked the family of a former U.S. senator. Fortunately, not seriously, but stuff goes on here that when you read it, you just are saying, what were they thinking? And the answer is they were pressing so hard that any kind of safety standards tends to go out the windows. Now, there's a fallout from that. 1993, there's a contractor digging a hole behind a house in what by then was a very upmarket housing area. And out of the hole comes an artillery shell, not this one, but an artillery shell. So he stops, and they call the police, and the police call an Army EOD squad who comes out, looks at it, and they call a disposal unit from the Chemical Corps, who comes down and says, this is a 75 millimeter shell filled with war gases. It becomes a major cleanup operation that continues. I have found funding for it continuing through 2022. And it was turning up stuff like unexploded ammunition in the back garden of the South Korean ambassador's house. God knows how much stuff was buried there, but it was all over the place. They had to carry out tons of contaminated earth. It was just a major goat rope. Now, in 1917, finally, the War Department puts together something called the Gas Warfare Office. Now, it's got a civilian War Department official in charge of it, and it's a coordinating operation, not a command or control. And the jobs are doled out. The medical department is told to take care of defensive stuff. The Ordnance Department is told to take care of offensive stuff. Research belongs to the Bureau of Mines. And oh, by the way, the people that are going to do it on the battlefield are from the Corps of Engineers. And there's going to be a gas defense school established at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, with instructors from the medical department who, of course, have no knowledge of or experience with chemical warfare. Again, no prizes for figuring out just how efficiently that worked for a while. Finally, in October, the Brits have sent some of their people over, and their advice is basically give everything except the treatment of casualties and perhaps the design of the masks to the Corps of Engineers. They do leave research in the hand of the Bureau of Mines because by that point, nobody could figure out how to pry them out of the positions. November 1917, the Army buys a big chunk of ground, which at that time was called Gunpowder Neck, sticking out into Chesapeake Bay up northeast of Baltimore. It gets renamed Edgewood Arsenal. And this is where the U.S. attitude differs considerably from the way things have been done by the British and French. We go into this with an industrial mindset. Edgewood is going to become a massive plant for the production of chemical warfare agents and eventually for the loading of artillery shells. There's a lot of small factories around the country that are also involved in this, but that's the eventual size of the facility that was going to produce chlorine. They were also producing phosgene, mustard, and chloropicrin here in supposedly, by the time we get going, massive quantities. You remember I said our contribution would have changed things in 1919, because by 1919, Edgewood would have been producing more chemical agent than all of Europe put together. And the intent was to use it on German cities and German units in absolutely vast quantities. They also did testing here, what was called man testing. The thing on the left is a gas chamber, and how you tested a mask was to put a mask on somebody, he goes into a contaminated atmosphere. On the right, these soldiers are checking to see how easy it is to breathe through the American version of the smallpox respirator. Now, early on, we try to show off to the British in particular by making a lot of 20,000 of our own copies of their smallpox respirator and proudly sending them across to be tested, to be found that they fail completely. The cloth that they are used with is very penetrable by chloropicrin. The chemicals that are used in the mask filter tend to chunk up and become big pieces that the gas filters its way through. Doesn't work. So they go back to the drawing board, and what we eventually do is begin to produce a copy of the smallpox respirator. There are some small factories around the country that are doing it, but the big one is the gas defense plant at Long Island City, New York, which employs 12,000 workers, and they make an effort to employ people who basically have relatives in the AEF on the belief that that's going to make them work more carefully. In the end, that plant produces 5.5 million masks, but we don't have them at the start of the war. We have to buy them from the British. And somebody has the wild idea, let's buy 100,000 smallpox respirators for the first troops we send over. And we'll also buy 100,000 of the French M2 so they can have a spare mask. Only problem is people try to change masks in mid-gas, which doesn't work well. Now, this gentleman is Amos Fries. He arrives in France in July of 1917 as an engineer lieutenant colonel. And he thinks his job is going to be directing the road building program for the AEF. But a couple of days after he gets there, he is approached and asked, "Would you take over the new AEF gas service?" Thinks about it, says yes, discovers that he is the AEF gas service, gets a couple of staff officers, talks to Pershing, who sends him off to talk to the British Special Brigade, the British organization that is responsible for gas warfare in the British Army. He becomes a true believer. Anybody who's been in the Army has encountered people who got in on the bottom floor of some program. They see the future of their career in that program, and they become salesmen for it. This is Freeze. He does his level best, first of all, to get gas staff officers in all the units as they arrive. There aren't enough to go around. He does the level best he can. And he tries to sell the use of gas as an offensive weapon to all the various AEF commanders. The fact is that a lot of American Army officers regard gas as being dishonorable, inhumane, and not something an American should do. So he's got quite a problem of sales. He gets promoted to colonel. As you can see in the picture, he eventually becomes a brigadier general. He's got a picture of what he wants the AES gas service. I apologize for this. It's a small picture in the original, so it's blurry. But you'll notice he's got a box here that's even bigger than the commander-in-chief. And he implies that the Chemical Warfare Service back in the U.S. is working for him. I will have to tell you that they thought that he was working for them. You would have an offensive branch, the people who actually did it, plus staff personnel and schools. You had a defensive branch, which was involved with training people and with medical treatment of gas casualties. Now, the organization that was going to do it was the 1st Gas Regiment, formed out of the basis of an engineer regiment. And you'll notice it was formed by an AEF general order, not a War Department general order. August 1917. They formed 2 companies to begin with, and they make a really strong recruiting drive around the country, looking for active, intelligent, well set up men to come. You know, they project this as being the wave of the future. Now, they come up with their own arm insignia, and they get their own collar insignia to start with, a dragon over artillery shells and a 1. If you saw Freeze, you remember he already had the cross chemical retorts that the Chemical Corps still uses. That comes a little bit later. But the problem is, it's August 1917, we don't have anybody who is qualified to train them. They go to they get sent to the American University Experiment Station, and they get basic training as being good soldiers. They get sent over to a Navy rifle range at Annapolis for 1 day of shooting their rifles. They get lectures on chemicals from the people from the Bureau of Mines. They get some indications of what goes on by lectures by British and French officers and NCOs who come over. But when the first 2 companies leave to go to Europe in December 1917, they don't even have a gas mask. They got nothing. What happens is they are given over to train with the British Royal Engineer Special Brigade. They send them off for 5 weeks of training. This photograph would leave any safety officer in the modern Army in paroxysms. What it shows is American soldiers training with all the various devices that they would be expected to use in the delivery of gas. Mortars, 3-inch and 4-inch Stokes mortars. You have projectors back there. They haven't buried them yet. And these are either the canisters for the projectors, or they are gas cylinders for cloud gas training. After they get their 5 weeks of training, they are put into the line with the British troops. They conduct various shoots with the British using all the various different systems. And finally, by April of 1917, they're sent down to join up with the rest of the AEF. Now, they get some active use during the Aisne-Marne and some at Saint-Mihiel. Then they go forward up to getting ready for Meuse-Argonne. And what is found is that the pace, expected pace in the Meuse-Argonne is such that the projectors and cloud gas was not going to be usable. They took too long to set up, and in any case, you might be charging into your own gas. The artillery gets a lot of shells, particularly from the French, and what the gas regiment people do is, first of all, go through more training. In this case, it's the French showing Americans how to use the M2 mask. And the training of American divisions is very spotty. Some cooperate, some don't. Some appear not to have put it into their minds that they were going to have to do that. You also have a certain amount of resistance in some cases by commanders who are, to put it bluntly, afraid of the gas. Now, in at least one case, a Corps operations officer flatly refused to include planning for the use of gas in a Corps operations order unless he was given a letter, signed letter, stating that there could not be a single American casualty from the use of American gas. You would never do that with any other weapon system. But it's, like I said, the whole thing is spotty. The Americans haven't really taken on board everything to do with gas. It would have come later. Did they train with it? Some units did, some didn't. The big issue that we found was that because the training was so spotty, close to a third of American casualties were from gas, principally from mustard. Now, I mentioned about that Stokes mortar before. Once we get into Meuse-Argonne, all of a sudden the Stokes mortar becomes the principal chemical weapon. Teams of people from the 1st Gas Regiment are hauling these mortars forward, the 4-inch version of it, because the capacity of the shell is larger. They're staying as close as they can to the infantry. And in one of the examples of where, if you learn how to coordinate, you can get pretty good results. They were finding that where there was good communication between the infantry and the mortar teams, if the infantry ran into entrenched machine guns, the mortars could be emplaced and drop either white phosphorus or thermite on the machine gun nests. High explosive shells from the mortar would work as well, but they mostly had chemicals. You also had just smoke shells that would be used. Where you didn't have good coordination, the results, of course, were less good. And that was a case of often showing the experience of the infantry units involved. By the way, those of you who are my age and were in the Army remember the 4.2-inch chemical mortar, the 4 deuce. It is the exact descendant of the 4-inch Stokes, because the Stokes was fairly thick-walled and smooth-bored. Later on, the U.S. Army takes it, says we want to improve accuracy, and they rifled it out, which moved the size from 4-inch to 4.2-inch. Now, one of the things that was very well developed was gas casualty treatment. I think that the medical department probably listened to their British and French counterparts a little bit more than the operational people did. But A division in the Army was supposed to have 4 field hospitals. They'd have a reserve one for sick soldiers, one surgical one for the gunshot and artillery wounds, and one that specialized in treating gas casualties. There were supposed to be gas specialty hospitals further back. They really didn't get it done. Not every division, by the way, got all these hospitals put together, but a lot of them did. Casualty treatment. Well, for chlorine and phosgene, the treatment was mostly supportive. Help them breathe. If you're going to die, you would probably be identified fairly early on that you were so bad there was probably going to be nothing they could do for you. When it comes to mustard, the treatment is, let's get it off you. If you're already blistered, we'll dress the blisters and cover them. If it's your eyes, what we want to do is continually irrigate them. You've got conjunctivitis and your eyes are swollen shut from the fumes of mustard. That's what this nurse is doing. She is irrigating the eyes of that soldier, and they would move up and down the line of casualties, irrigating them, each one in turn. You'd get to the end, you'd go back to the start and do it all over again, because that was the treatment that proved to improve progress with your eyesight more than anything else. Now, there were decontaminants for mustard, but unfortunately, they tended to be about as caustic as the mustard is, just in a different way, bleaching powder. And even today, they use super topical bleach as a decontaminant for mustard. Something else that the U.S. military medical department designed was a degassing station. And this is degassing, meaning mustard. This shows it in a tent. They preferred to do it in a building if they could. But you bring the troops in, strip them down. Their contaminated clothing goes in a barrel of some kind to be taken off, either to be destroyed or decontaminated. And they move in to a shower area. They're getting hot water supplied by a tank truck, and they get to soap themselves down and wash the mustard off. They again can go out. They get clean clothes. Those that need to go for treatment can do so. If you've managed to get it off yourself quick enough, you may just have a little bit of time to rest, but then you can go back into the line. Didn't make a huge number of these, but they were made and they were used. Finally, in June of 1918, Amos Freeze, that famous salesman for gas warfare, has been complaining for a long time that he sees the gas warfare office back in the U.S. as being entirely unmilitary and not particularly well coordinated. So in June of 1918, Major General William Siebert is brought in to head up a new chemical warfare service in the U.S. Now, Siebert was an engineer, got his reputation by building the Gatun locks and the Panama Canal. He got promoted to general, but through one of the screw-ups that happens in the Army, he got promoted as a line officer, not as an engineer. War starts. He's a pretty senior 1-star, becomes a 2-star. He's given command of the 1st Infantry Division, the first organization that goes to Europe. John Pershing does not trust William Siebert because he doesn't think Siebert has the line officer chops to command a combat division. Eventually, Siebert is relieved and sent back to an engineer job in the U.S. However, when this new job comes up, Pershing is all in favor of bringing in a man he knows is an extremely good manager and organizer. Siebert takes over. Very quickly organizes it this way. Admin, research. In this case, the chemist who had been in charge of research on behalf of the Bureau of Mines gets to put on eagles, becomes a colonel, and stays in the same job. The same is true with the other chemists who are doing this. There's a gas defense section, gas offense. Development is looking at systems for the delivery of gas. Proving is doing just exactly that, testing it out. A lot of that's being done up at Edgewood. Medical section does exactly what it says. Training is coming up with training programs for use in the U.S., as well as advising on training overseas. Now, overseas and the 1st Gas Regiment, well, Siebert puts them under his organizational chart. Fries has them under his organizational chart, and it's not the only place in this war where the two sort of each think the other was working for them. Now we come up with something called lewisite, chlorovinyl arsine dichloride. Named lewisite after this gentleman, a Captain Lewis, a civilian chemist who was brought into the Army as a captain. Now, it had been identified by a student at Catholic University in D.C. a number of years before, who basically said, wow, this is nasty stuff. I don't want to work with it anymore. But he made notes about it and turned it over to his professor. They're looking for new war chemicals. And the professor gives information about this to Lewis, who immediately begins to experiment with it. Now, I want you to picture this. His first experiments produce a result that is so nasty that it peels the paint off of the walls of the chemical labs in the Catholic University Chemical Building, which is where he's working. Therefore, he moves on to the roof of the building and conducts his experiments with this stuff on the roof. Now, it's a vesicant, like mustard, causes blisters. Unlike mustard, it hurts as soon as it hits you. Their tests with rats and mice seem to indicate that it's much more toxic than mustard. All of a sudden, this becomes the secret weapon. What the Army does is to go out and find an abandoned automobile plant at a place called Willoughby, Ohio, north and east of Cleveland. They put wire up around it, and they begin shipping troops in. Its guy in charge of it, by the way, is then an Army captain by the name of James Bryan Conant, who later in life becomes the president of a little organization known as Harvard. This place is called the Mousetrap by people there because you go in and you don't come out. You can't talk about what you do. You can't communicate with your family about what you do. Your mail is sent to a mail drop box, which is then carried here. This is going to be the absolute war-winning ender. It's going to be the most horrible thing that's ever been used. Well, that's the story, at least. They begin to work throughout 1917 and into 1918. They finally begin production a few days before the armistice. Now, the first lot of this stuff, which seems to have been about 8 tons of it, is in stainless steel drums, and it's loaded on a train and taken to Edgewood, along with a whole bunch of other stuff that had been produced by the various factories at Edgewood. They load it onto a modified freighter. They take it 40 miles off the coast and throw it overboard. Exactly where, I don't think anybody kept track of. And how deep the water is, I also don't know. But it was done left, right, and backwards by everybody at the end of World War I. Some of this stuff might still well be down there. Now, how was gas used elsewhere? Well, the Italians got it first in June of 1916. The Austrians didn't use it heavily, but it was heavily used as part of the German break-in to Italian lines at Caporetto. And after that, the Italians pleaded for the British to send them smallpox respirators, which they did. It shows up at their times over there as well. On the Eastern Front, there were lots of use. Russia never, ever did properly protect its people. That mask of theirs really was not effective. They did buy a fair number, again, of smallpox respirators. The British made several million of them. And they did manage to make chlorine and phosgene, but they never really used it very effectively. The most effective use of gas over there probably was in the German attack on Riga in 1917. And between the combination of some innovative new artillery tactics and very targeted use of chemicals, the Russian line wasn't just broken, it was shattered. And finally, in April 1917, British were getting set to attack Gaza again. By the way, it was unsuccessful. And somebody discovered that they had a lot of 4.5-inch howitzer rounds with phosgene and chlorine in them, which they used on the Turks to pretty much no effect whatsoever. How much was used? Those are probably estimates in most cases. 125,000 tons of agents, 1.3 million casualties. Lingering effects could be scars from mustard, or it could be continuing problems with breathing. You only had about 100,000 deaths, mostly from phosgene, but about 1/3 of all the U.S. casualties are from gas, attributable in large measure by how unhomogeneous American training in gas defense was. Psychological effects of the gas were often very important. It was as much a psychological weapon as it was a physical weapon. There was something called gas mania, which was generally the equivalent of shell shock. We also had gas panic, where one guy in a unit would suddenly decide he'd been gassed, and all of a sudden other people in the unit felt they were gassed as well. They'd all go running back to the dressing station. None of them were gassed. They'd give them a cup of tea or a cup of coffee and an aspirin, telling them it was an all-purpose antidote to gas, and send them back. But for everybody except those who made their living with gas, there was revulsion against it. And the post-war debate on banning chemical war continued on and on and on for quite a long time. Now, you remember back in that rule that was written in 1899, and I've highlighted that word soul because after the war, the Germans were accused of violating this rule. Their argument was, well, our shells had both high explosive and gas in it. The explosive produced a fragmentary effect, therefore it wasn't the sole object of the shell. And oh, by the way, if you release it from a canister, there's no projectile involved anyway. Literally used by the German government as an argument against violating Hague Convention. Now, Fritz Haber was the heart and soul of German chemical warfare. He was treated after the war very differently, different places. 1918, the end of the war, he showed up on an Allied list of war criminals that they wanted tried. Bad enough that he put on a false beard and went to Switzerland for a while. However, it soon became apparent that the Allies were really not serious about this. Nobody wanted to go through and open that can of worms. So he comes home. And in 1919, he is given the Nobel Prize for Chemistry for the Haber process. This is, without too much trouble saying it, a very controversial thing. There's a lot of the Allied recipients who will not go to his presentation. There's a couple that even turned down the prize in protest. Fine, but from 1918 on to 1933, he's still a director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry, a premier chemical research facility. A little bit ironically, for a man from Jewish background, one of the things that's developed while he's there is a substance called Zyklon A. It's a pesticide. and it was one of the first of the nerve agents. After he leaves, it's further developed into Zyklon B, which becomes the execution gas for German death camps. Now, in 1933, we got the little man with the toothbrush mustache is in power. Anti-Jewish laws are in force, and Jewish staff has to be dismissed. Haber, who had converted to Christianity, thought he'd be protected. After all, look what he did in World War I. He wasn't. He eventually leaves Germany, goes first to Britain. He's not particularly welcome in Britain. He leaves there, goes to Switzerland, and dies in 1934 of a heart condition. And there he stays. And you might think that that's the end of the story. It isn't. 1953, after the reestablishment of the Federal Republic of Germany, the old Kaiser Wilhelm Institute becomes part of the Max Planck Society in Germany and is renamed the Fritz Haber Institute. Again, it's somewhat controversial, and there is a plaque up on the institute that acknowledges that fact, but it remains the name of the place to this day. Now, some post-war views. Amos Freeze. He comes back to the U.S., eventually replaces Siebert as the head of the Chemical Warfare Service in the Army, and he is a salesman still for chemical warfare, believing that every civilized nation should use it. And of course, we have the unreconstructed imperialist. In his defense, some of the other comments made about the same time indicate he may have been talking about something more like tear gas than phosgene. Nonetheless, Winston Churchill, as I said, he was an imperialist to the tips of his toes. And if anything was going to help support maintaining the British Empire, he was in favor of it. On the other hand, John Pershing was involved with an arms control summit in D.C. in 21, and he ran the Committee on Land Armaments, and this is what he wrote. Abhorrent to civilization, cruel, unfair, and improper, demoralizes the better instincts of humanity. John did not like it one bit, and that probably is one of the reasons why the dislike of chemical warfare percolated through some of the senior commanders in the AEF. But it continues on. In 1920, the budget hearings, the Army attempts to eliminate the Chemical Warfare Service, to drop it from the rolls. Amos Freeze pops up again. The American Legion backs him. The American Chemical Society backs him. He's got friends in Congress. Congress kept the money in the budget, and the Chemical Warfare Service became a permanent part of the Army structure, eventually becoming the Chemical Corps. 1922, there was something called the Gas and Submarine Limitation Treaty. Now, this time, the U.S. ratifies it, but France refused to, and that killed the treaty. 1925, organization in Geneva, with that wonderful long name, International Conference for the Control of Traffic in Arms and Ammunition. Diplomats can't speak in short phrases. And they come up with this, which is even worse. Geneva Protocol for the Prohibition of the Use of Asphyxiating, Poisonous, or Other Gases and Bacteriological Methods of Warfare. It's interesting, they were also already thinking about bacteriological warfare. Whoops, here comes Amos again. This time, it's friends in Congress, and the treaty, while the U.S. signed it, never got out of committee in the Senate. We eventually ratified it in 1975. However, the big gun is the Chemical Weapons Convention of 1993. That's when it was published, comes into effect in 1997, when enough countries agree to it. 193 different countries were not going to produce it, have it, or use it. And oh, by the way, we're going to get rid of anything that we have, and we're going to destroy anything we have that you can use to make chemical weapons. In some cases, this is a tall job. There is one country that's signed but not ratified, Israel. Not quite sure why. There are three countries, Egypt, North Korea, and South Sudan, that haven't signed it. Egypt may be doing it to put pressure on Israel. North Korea is just being North Korea. And I don't think there's anything nefarious about South Sudan. They just haven't had a government that's been stable for long enough to get all the way through the signature and ratification process. Now, there's an outfit in Geneva called the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. They are responsible under the UN for administering this treaty. They say that 99% of all known chemical weapons have been destroyed. I underline known. We know that North Korea has V agents, at least. They used them to assassinate Kim Jong-un's brother. If Russia has gotten rid of all their chemical agents, where did the Novichok nerve agent come from that they've used in several assassination attempts? There are others around. There's also a problem. There are certain things which have valid peacetime uses that were chemical warfare agents in World War I, specifically chlorine, phosgene, and chloropicrin. You can make them, you can have them, you can use them for peaceful uses, but they're not considered chemical weapons. And that's where things like the chlorine use in Syria comes from. I was an intelligence officer, and I tend to be very skeptical about high-end estimates. I can be fairly sure there's somebody out there somewhere who's got something they're holding on to just in case. Now, here's a question for you. Did gas warfare work in World War I? If you talked to the people who were responsible for the gas, it worked wonderfully. This was a wonderful weapon. The enemy was terrified by it, and we had wonderful results from it. Reading results after the war leads somewhat different conclusions. My personal opinion is that the only two times that chemical weapons can be said to have been directly decisive was in that German attack at Riga and in the German break-in at Caporetto, because there isn't any place else where you can point to and say that a battle was lost or won because of the use of chemicals. But it was unique for the time, thank God. No chemicals used in World War II in Europe. They were used by the Japanese. There's a debate about why it wasn't used in Europe. Hitler had been gassed, and it could be that it was his revulsion against that, or it could be that they were afraid of retaliation. But whatever happened, it ended in a big way with the 11th of November, 1918. That's it, folks.
Lee, thank you very much. That was a great summary of a lot of material. I think the story still hasn't completely been told. It remains a controversy to this very day. And as you point out, nobody's really sure what people have in the backs of their armories in the way of chemical weapons. But it's certainly increased my understanding of what went on, and I think is a great summary and one of our better lectures. Jerry did have a question, which I think you've answered in the last 5 minutes, which is how effective was it, especially compared to more conventional munitions such as artillery, bullets, and explosives of other kinds. And the answer really very effective. I think we can all be grateful that it hasn't been used very widely since then. But those of us that have been in the Army will testify that you still have to carry a gas mask around with you. You still have to train in using a gas mask and, in fact, protective gear, which remains just as uncomfortable as the stuff that Lee showed us. And there's always the fear that somebody is going to start using it and force us into another equivalent of World War I with tit for tat use of chemical warfare.
And the problem is that some of it is so easy to use and so easy to make.
Indeed it is. All right. Well, thank you very much, Lee. That was a great lecture. Thank you all for attending this lecture. We will see you next month.